Everyone believed the killer was standing beside the police, helping them search for the truth. They watched the news, comforted the grieving family, and even pleaded for justice in front of television cameras. No one questioned their tears. No one doubted their words. But every search they joined, every interview they gave, and every promise they made was carefully designed to hide one terrifying fact. They already knew exactly where the answers were. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of a real murder investigation that left detectives chasing the wrong direction, while the person responsible quietly earned their trust. Inspired by one of the most astonishing deception cases in modern criminal history, we'll use fictional names for individuals while staying faithful to the documented events and investigation. It is a story that reveals how appearances can overpower evidence, how grief can be performed, and how a murderer managed to fool almost everyone, until one overlooked detail brought the entire illusion crashing down. The town of Ashford had always been the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other by name, children played outside until sunset, and violent crime was something people only watched on television. That sense of security vanished overnight when 34-year-old Emily Carter, a well-loved elementary school teacher, failed to arrive for work on a Monday morning. She never missed class. She never ignored calls from her family. When officers entered her home for a welfare check, they found signs that something terrible had happened, but Emily was gone. Within hours, local police launched an urgent investigation, and news of her disappearance spread across the state. Volunteers poured into Ashford, determined to bring her home, while reporters camped outside the police station searching for answers. Among the first people to step forward was Ryan Brooks, a longtime family friend who appeared devastated by Emily's disappearance. He comforted her parents, spoke confidently to reporters, and spent countless hours helping officers organize search efforts. To everyone watching, Ryan looked like exactly the kind of person every grieving family hopes to have by their side. As the days turned into weeks, investigators faced a mystery that refused to make sense. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransom demand, and no obvious suspect. Every lead seemed to disappear as quickly as it appeared. Ryan Brooks became one of the investigation's most recognizable faces, standing shoulder to shoulder with detectives during community searches and urging anyone with information to come forward. His emotional interviews were shared across television and social media, and many praised his determination to help bring Emily home. Yet behind that image of compassion lay a secret that nobody, not Emily's family, not the reporters, and not even the experienced detectives leading the investigation, could imagine. Ryan wasn't searching because he wanted answers. He was searching because he needed to know how close the police were getting to the truth. Every question investigators asked, every location they searched, and every new piece of evidence they discussed gave him another chance to stay one step ahead. But while almost everyone was convinced Ryan Brooks was a grieving friend, one experienced investigator quietly noticed a small inconsistency that refused to leave his mind. At first, it seemed too insignificant to matter. Before long, it would become the first crack in a deception that had fooled an entire community. Long before anyone had heard the name Emily Carter on the evening news, she had built a reputation for putting others before herself. Friends described her as dependable, thoughtful, and impossible to discourage. She spent her weekdays teaching young children and her weekends volunteering at community events, believing that small acts of kindness could change someone's life. Her parents often said Emily had the rare ability to make complete strangers feel like lifelong friends within minutes of meeting them. She wasn't famous, wealthy, or connected to powerful people. She was simply someone who had earned the trust of everyone around her. That was why her disappearance struck Ashford so deeply. People weren't just searching for another missing person. They were searching for someone they genuinely believed deserved to come home. The growing fear wasn't only about what had happened to Emily. It was about the realization that whoever had taken her had been close enough to gain her confidence without raising a single alarm. No one seemed more committed to finding Emily than Ryan Brooks. He arrived early at every volunteer search, stayed until everyone else had gone home, and was often the first to comfort Emily's exhausted parents whenever another day ended without answers. Television cameras captured him urging the public not to lose hope, while local newspapers praised his tireless efforts. Detectives appreciated his cooperation because he always appeared willing to answer questions and offered details whenever they asked. Looking at Ryan, there was nothing that suggested he was hiding anything. He spoke calmly, maintained eye contact, and never appeared nervous, even as investigators publicly announced they were narrowing their list of possible suspects. To the community, Ryan became a symbol of loyalty. If anyone had suggested he deserved closer scrutiny, they would likely have been dismissed immediately. Yet one veteran detective couldn't ignore a growing list of tiny inconsistencies. Ryan always seemed unusually informed about developments that had not yet been released to the public. During interviews, he occasionally corrected details before investigators had finished asking their questions. They were subtle moments that most people overlooked, but experienced detectives know that major cases are often solved not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by small details that refuse to fit. Without telling anyone outside the investigative team, the detective made a quiet decision that would change the course of the entire case. Instead of looking for a stranger, he began taking a much closer look at the man everyone trusted the most. As investigators rebuilt Emily Carter's final known movements, an ordinary Sunday slowly transformed into a timeline filled with unanswered questions. Security cameras showed Emily leaving a neighborhood grocery store shortly after 5 in the afternoon. She smiled at the cashier, exchanged a brief conversation with an elderly customer, and drove toward her home only a few miles away. Her mobile phone connected to the nearest cell tower one last time just minutes later before falling completely silent. There were no emergency calls, no frantic text messages, and no signs that she believed she was in danger. Her car was later found parked exactly where it should have been, with her handbag still inside and the keys missing. Detectives immediately realized this wasn't a random disappearance. Whoever had approached Emily hadn't forced their way into her life. She had willingly let that person get close enough to lower her guard. That single realization dramatically changed the direction of the investigation, because it suggested the person responsible was someone she already knew and trusted. While forensic teams carefully examined every inch of Emily's home, Ryan Brooks remained exactly where everyone expected him to be, at the center of the search effort. He organized volunteer groups, distributed missing person flyers, and stood beside Emily's parents as television reporters asked painful questions they could barely answer. His calm presence reassured the community, but behind closed doors, investigators were beginning to notice a pattern they couldn't explain. Ryan repeatedly asked detectives whether they had recovered any DNA, whether surveillance cameras had captured anything useful, and whether they believed the case was moving in the right direction. At first, those questions sounded like the concern of a worried friend. But Detective Daniel Harris, the investigator who had quietly started paying closer attention, believed something felt different. Ryan wasn't asking emotional questions about Emily's safety. He was asking investigative questions, questions that seemed focused on what the police knew rather than what had happened to Emily. Harris chose not to confront him. Instead, he instructed his team to keep listening, keep watching, and tell Ryan nothing that wasn't already public. If Ryan Brooks truly had nothing to hide, the investigation would prove it. But if the respected volunteer standing beside detectives was secretly guiding the search away from the truth, time, not pressure, would eventually expose the mistake he believed no one would ever notice. Detective Daniel Harris had worked enough homicide investigations to know that the loudest clues were often the least reliable. Witness statements changed, rumors spread faster than facts, and public pressure could easily pull an investigation in the wrong direction. Instead of chasing speculation, Harris ordered his team to rebuild Emily Carter's final 48 hours minute by minute. Every phone call was logged. Every bank transaction was reviewed. Every security camera within miles of her home was examined again, this time frame by frame. Most of it confirmed what detectives already knew. Emily had followed her normal routine right up until the moment she disappeared. Then one analyst noticed something unusual. Ryan Brooks's mobile phone had connected to a cell tower far closer to Emily's neighborhood than he had originally claimed during his interview. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything. Cell towers could cover wide areas, and innocent explanations existed. But it was the first piece of evidence that directly conflicted with Ryan's own account. Harris didn't announce the discovery. He simply added another file to the growing stack carrying Ryan's name. Meanwhile, Ryan continued playing the role everyone admired. He attended community prayer services, hugged Emily's grieving parents, and appeared on local television urging anyone with information to come forward. His performance was so convincing that many viewers began thanking him publicly for refusing to give up hope. Yet behind the scenes, detectives deliberately released only limited information to him. They wanted to know whether details that had never been made public would somehow find their way into Ryan's conversations. It didn't take long. During an informal discussion outside the police station, Ryan casually mentioned that investigators were focusing on a wooded area outside Ashford. The statement immediately caught Harris's attention because that location had never been disclosed to volunteers or the media. Only a handful of investigators even knew it was being searched. When Harris asked Ryan where he had heard that information, Ryan smiled and brushed it aside, saying he had probably misunderstood something during a conversation with another volunteer. It sounded harmless, but Harris wasn't convinced. Someone had either leaked confidential information, or Ryan Brooks knew far more about the investigation than he should have. From that moment forward, the detectives stopped seeing him as merely a helpful friend. Quietly and without alerting anyone outside the investigative team, they began treating him as the one person who might be leading them toward the truth by trying so hard to steer them away from it. Detective Daniel Harris understood that suspicion alone would never solve Emily Carter's case. If Ryan Brooks had been responsible from the very beginning, then he had already spent weeks convincing an entire community that he was nothing more than a loyal friend searching for justice. An arrest based on instinct would fall apart in court. Harris needed evidence that couldn't be explained away. So instead of confronting Ryan, investigators quietly expanded their investigation. Search warrants were obtained for Ryan's phone records, financial activity, vehicle movements, and digital history. Every hour of surveillance footage collected throughout Ashford was reviewed once again, this time with Ryan as the focus rather than the victim. What detectives discovered wasn't dramatic on its own, but together the pieces formed a troubling pattern. Ryan's timeline shifted slightly every time he retold it. The differences were measured in minutes, not hours, yet they always placed him just far enough away from Emily's last known location to avoid suspicion. To most people, those inconsistencies would seem insignificant. To Detective Harris, they suggested someone carefully adjusting a story instead of simply remembering the truth. Then came the discovery that changed the entire direction of the investigation. A forensic analyst examining data recovered from Ryan's mobile phone found evidence that several location services had been manually disabled shortly before Emily disappeared and reactivated later that same evening. Ryan had previously insisted his phone must have been inaccurate because the signal had been weak that day. Now detectives had reason to believe the missing location data wasn't an accident at all. Around the same time, investigators recovered surveillance footage from a privately owned warehouse several streets away from Emily's neighborhood. The recording was grainy, and no faces could be identified, but one vehicle passed through the area at a time investigators could no longer ignore. It matched the make, model, and color of Ryan Brooks's truck. Harris still refused to make an arrest. The evidence was growing stronger. But he believed Ryan had spent too much time manipulating everyone to suddenly stop making mistakes. If they remained patient, the man who had fooled detectives, reporters, and an entire town might soon reveal the one truth he could no longer keep hidden. What Harris didn't know was that Ryan was becoming increasingly confident, believing he had successfully stayed one step ahead of the investigation. That confidence was about to become the very thing that would destroy everything he had worked so hard to protect. Ryan Brooks had spent weeks convincing everyone that he was grieving alongside Emily Carter's family. By now, his face had become as familiar on television as the detectives leading the investigation. People thanked him in grocery stores for refusing to give up. Volunteers looked to him for direction during search efforts. Even experienced reporters described him as one of the few people keeping Emily's parents hopeful. It was exactly the image Ryan wanted the world to see. But Detective Daniel Harris believed something important had changed. The more confident Ryan became, the less careful he seemed. Harris often reminded his team that people who successfully maintain a lie for long enough eventually begin believing no one can see through it. That confidence usually creates the mistake that exposes everything. Instead of increasing pressure, Harris instructed investigators to remain patient. Every interview Ryan gave was reviewed. Every public appearance was documented. Every conversation with detectives was carefully compared with the growing collection of evidence. Somewhere inside those hundreds of hours was the contradiction they needed. The breakthrough arrived from a place no one expected. While examining items collected during an early search, forensic specialists decided to reanalyze a small piece of material that had originally been dismissed as insignificant. Improvements in laboratory testing revealed microscopic fibers that matched the interior upholstery of Ryan Brooks's truck. Detectives immediately compared those findings with additional evidence recovered from the vehicle under a newly issued search warrant. This time, they found something impossible to ignore. Hidden deep beneath the carpet lining were tiny traces of Emily Carter's DNA. Ryan had cleaned the truck repeatedly, but he had overlooked evidence so small it couldn't be seen with the naked eye. The discovery transformed the investigation overnight. For weeks, detectives had suspected Ryan was hiding the truth. Now they had scientific evidence placing Emily inside the very vehicle Ryan insisted she had never entered. Detective Harris remained cautious. He knew this was the strongest evidence they had uncovered, but he also knew Ryan Brooks had fooled almost everyone once already. If they moved too quickly, they risked giving him one final opportunity to escape responsibility. So instead of making an immediate arrest, Harris prepared one final interview, convinced that when Ryan was confronted with evidence he couldn't explain, the carefully constructed image that had deceived an entire community would finally begin to collapse. When Ryan Brooks walked into the interview room, he carried the same quiet confidence that had convinced almost everyone of his innocence. He greeted Detective Daniel Harris politely, accepted a cup of coffee, and settled into his chair as though this were just another routine conversation. After weeks of speaking with investigators, Ryan knew the questions almost by heart. Where had he been that evening? Had he remembered anything new? Was there anyone Emily Carter might have trusted enough to leave with willingly? His answers came smoothly, almost rehearsed. He repeated the same timeline he had shared before, insisting he had spent the evening making phone calls, helping organize volunteers, and praying that Emily would be found alive. For a few moments, nothing seemed different. Ryan even managed a sympathetic smile when Emily's name was mentioned, continuing the role that had earned him the trust of the town. But Detective Harris wasn't interested in the story Ryan had practiced. He was interested in the parts Ryan never expected anyone to uncover. Without raising his voice, Harris placed several photographs on the table. They showed the inside of Ryan's truck after forensic specialists had completed their latest examination. Then came the laboratory report confirming that microscopic traces of Emily Carter's DNA had been recovered from beneath the vehicle's carpet lining. Ryan's expression changed almost instantly. The confidence that had defined every public appearance began to fade. He stared silently at the photographs before looking back at Harris, searching for an explanation that wouldn't come. For the first time since Emily disappeared, Ryan wasn't controlling the conversation. Harris calmly explained that detectives had also reconstructed Ryan's movements using surveillance footage, mobile phone records, and witness statements gathered over several weeks. Piece by piece, the carefully crafted timeline Ryan had relied upon was falling apart. The man who had once stood beside detectives, comforting Emily's family and urging the public to trust the investigation, now found himself facing evidence that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Harris leaned forward and asked one simple question. "Ryan, if you've told us the truth from the beginning, how do you explain Emily Carter's DNA inside your truck?" The room fell silent. Ryan opened his mouth as though he wanted to answer, but no words came. After weeks of fooling an entire community, The perfect performance had finally reached the moment where the truth demanded an explanation. The silence inside the interview room seemed to last forever. Ryan Brooks stared at the photographs spread across the table, his eyes fixed on the forensic report Detective Daniel Harris had carefully placed in front of him. Only a few hours earlier, Ryan had walked into the station, convinced this would be another routine interview, another opportunity to reassure investigators that he was simply a concerned friend searching for Emily Carter. Instead, every answer he had rehearsed over the previous weeks suddenly felt useless. Harris didn't interrupt the silence. Years of experience had taught him that when a carefully constructed lie begins to collapse, people often reveal more by what they don't say than by the words they choose. Ryan shifted in his chair, glanced toward the door, and quietly insisted there had to be a mistake. He claimed Emily had never been inside his truck and suggested the forensic evidence must have been contaminated. Harris listened without reacting. Then he calmly explained that the laboratory had repeated the analysis multiple times and reached the same conclusion each time. The evidence wasn't standing alone anymore. It matched the surveillance timeline, the phone records, and the growing number of inconsistencies Ryan had offered throughout the investigation. Detectives continued presenting the evidence one piece at a time, never giving Ryan the chance to regain control of the conversation. Every new document answered another question that had troubled investigators since Emily Carter disappeared. Ryan's changing timeline, his unexplained knowledge of confidential search locations, and the missing location data from his phone no longer appeared to be isolated coincidences. Together, they painted a picture of someone who had spent weeks carefully managing how the investigation unfolded while trying to stay one step ahead of the detectives leading it. Harris looked directly at Ryan and reminded him that Emily's family had trusted him completely. They had welcomed him into their home, accepted his comforting words, and believed he was helping bring Emily back. Those words carried more weight than any accusation. For the first time since the investigation began, Ryan's composure visibly cracked. His shoulders dropped, his confident tone disappeared, and the image that had convinced an entire community slowly began to unravel. Outside the interview room, investigators waited quietly, knowing they had reached the moment they had been working toward since Detective Daniel Harris first questioned the man everyone else believed was beyond suspicion. Outside the interview room, the atmosphere inside the Ashford Police Department had changed completely. For weeks, Detective Daniel Harris and his team had been forced to watch Ryan Brooks move freely through the community, standing beside Emily Carter's family and speaking to reporters as though he shared their heartbreak. Now, for the first time, investigators believed they finally had enough evidence to uncover the truth. Ryan remained seated in silence, occasionally shaking his head as if refusing to accept what was unfolding around him. Harris didn't celebrate the moment. He knew that solving a case wasn't about proving detectives right. It was about delivering answers to a family that had been living through unimaginable pain. One final search, carried out using information gathered during the investigation, led detectives to the evidence they had been searching for since Emily vanished. The discovery confirmed what Harris had suspected from the beginning. The person who had comforted the family, organized the searches, and publicly demanded justice had been carefully protecting himself all along. News of Ryan Brooks's arrest spread across Ashford within hours, leaving the entire community in disbelief. Neighbors who had praised him struggled to accept that the man they trusted most had been living behind a carefully constructed mask. Emily Carter's parents later described the betrayal as almost impossible to comprehend. Losing Emily had shattered their world, but learning that someone they had welcomed into their lives had deceived them from the very beginning created a second heartbreak they never saw coming. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence piece by piece, showing jurors how Ryan's own actions gradually exposed the truth. The changing timelines, the forensic findings, the digital records, and the mistakes made while trying to stay ahead of investigators all formed a single, undeniable picture. Detective Daniel Harris would later reflect that the case served as a reminder that appearances can be remarkably convincing, but facts cannot be persuaded. Ryan Brooks had fooled neighbors, volunteers, reporters, and even seasoned investigators for a time. In the end, It wasn't a dramatic confession or a lucky guess that brought the deception to an end. It was patience, careful police work, and one small piece of evidence that refused to disappear. Emily Carter finally received the justice her family had fought for, and Ashford was left with a lesson few would ever forget. Sometimes the person standing closest to the search is the one hoping the truth is never found. As you reflect on this case, ask yourself one question. If someone appeared as helpful and compassionate as Ryan Brooks, would you have trusted them too?